So this is the core schema that we defined earlier in this section. Now, by default, all these properties that we defined here, they're optional. So if I create a course and leave out all these properties and then save that course to the database, that will be a perfectly valid operation. MongoDB doesn't care that we have a course that doesn't have a name or doesn't have a price. So in this lecture, I'm going to show you how to implement validation. So let's revert this back. Now, for this demo, I'm only going to talk about the required validator, but we have more built-in validators that you're going to learn about in the next lecture. So let's make this name required. First, we replace string with an object. Here we set the type to string, and then we set required to true. With this, if I create a course without a name, so let's comment this out. At the time I try to save this course to the database, I'm going to get an exception. Let me show you. So first, let's go back to the end of this file and replace remove course with create course. Now back in terminal, let's run the application. All right, look at what we got. We got this unhandled promise rejection. If you see that error, that basically means that you're dealing with a promise. That promise is rejected, but you have not handled that rejection. So just to refresh your memory, remember promises can be in three states. Initially, they're pending, then they can be either fulfilled or rejected. In this case, we have a rejected promise, but we have not handled that properly. So back in the code, here when saving this course to the database, look, the save method is returning a promise. We're awaiting that to get the result. So with this implementation, we're only assuming the success scenario. If the promise is rejected, we don't have any code to handle that. So earlier I told you that you should put this code in a try-catch block. So let's move this here. Add the catch block. Here we get an exception, and then we can display exception.message on the console. Now back in the terminal, let's run the application one more time. So we don't get that warning anymore. Instead, we get this error message. Course validation failed. Path name is required. So if you have an invalid course object, Mongoose doesn't allow us to save that course to the database. So validation automatically kicks in at the time we try to save a course to the database. We can also manually trigger the validation. So let me comment out these two lines. This course object has a validate method. Now this validate method, look, it returns a promise of void. So we can await it. And if our course is invalid, then we'll get an exception and we'll end up in this catch block. Let's go back to the terminal. So node index.js, look, we got the same validation error. Path name is required. Now, one thing I personally don't like about the design of Mongoose is that this validate method returns a promise of void. So here we don't have any result. Ideally, this validate method should return a Boolean. So we could call this is valid. And then if the course is not valid, we could have some logic here. So this is a design flaw in Mongoose. It returns a promise of void. Now, the only option to get that kind of Boolean is to pass a callback here. So instead of awaiting the promise, we have to go back to the callback-based approach. So here we pass a function that takes an error object, and then we can check if we have any errors, then we can execute some logic. Now you might ask, we already have this catch block here. So if we have any validation errors, we can execute that kind of logic here. That is true, but writing code like that is a little bit messy. So I hope sometime in the future, Mongoose team change this method to return a Boolean. Now that aside, let's remove this code and go back to our original code. One thing I need to clarify here is that this validation that we implemented on the name property is only meaningful in Mongoose. MongoDB doesn't care about this name property. So if you have worked with databases like SQL Server or MySQL, you know that in these databases, we can define validation at the database level. For example, in our courses table, we can have a name column and we can mark that column as required. With that, we cannot store a course without the name in our database. In MongoDB, we don't have that. MongoDB doesn't care about any of this stuff. So this validation we have implemented here is only meaningful in Mongoose. At the time we try to save a course, Mongoose runs the validation logic, and if the course is not valid, it won't save it to the database. Now, one last thing I need to clarify here before we finish this lecture. Earlier in the section about Express, I introduced you to a Node package called Joy. We use Joy for validation. So you might be asking, Mosh, we have two kinds of validation. Should we use Joy or should we use Mongoose's validation? The answer is both. These kind of validations complement each other. So we use Joy in our RESTful APIs. We use that as the first attack to make sure the data that the client is sending us is valid data. But we still need this kind of validation in Mongoose to make sure that the data we save to the database is in the right shape. Because it is possible that the client sends us a valid course in the body of the request, but when we create a course object in our HTTP service, perhaps we may forget to set the name property to what we get from request.body.name. So by enforcing validation in Mongoose, we can ensure that programming errors like this won't result in invalid documents to be persisted in a MongoDB database. Next, we're going to look at the built-in validators in Mongoose.